Cathryn Miller-Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of HIAS Pennsylvania, and we want to welcome you to our program, HIAS Pennsylvania's ICE Raids, What You Need to Know. And just a note for the audience, we are going to take questions after Philip and I get a chance to talk about ICE raids. I'm really thrilled to introduce our legal director, Philippe Weisz. He has his own great story to tell, but tonight we're going to talk about ICE raids, not his great story. So you'll have to ask him at another time. Okay, so we've prepared some questions in advance that we thought the audience would like to know. So tell us, Philip, what is ICE other than frozen water?
And I wish we could just say that that's all it was.
Right.
Well, good evening, everybody, and happy, sad to see that there's so many people here. Unfortunately, it is something of great concern to all of us, I think, kind of across the country. This question as to what we're seeing on a daily basis in our news reports from the communities that we live in and from individuals that we know. So who is ICE? ICE stands for the Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they are one of the three federal agencies within the Department of Homeland Security. Department of Homeland Security was formed after 9/11 and essentially abolished INS, or the Immigration Nationality Services, and created this new entity, Department of Homeland Security, which has three federal agencies. One of them is USCIS, or U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's essentially the benefits arm of the Department of Homeland Security. So if you're thinking someone who's applying for citizenship, it is USCIS that adjudicates those applications. And so that's one of the entities. The other one is CBP, or Customs and Border Patrol. Those are the agents that you'll see at the airports when you're entering, whether or not you're a U.S. citizen or what have you, you're traveling from abroad and you're presenting your documents. Those are the CBP officers that you are interacting with. And then finally is ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement. They are the interior enforcement agents for immigration services for the Department of Homeland Security.
Thanks, Philip. I just wanted to, before going on to the next question, I just wanted to stress something that you said that struck me. So ICE was actually not created until after 9/11. Is that what you said?
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. And
So
essentially all of those, the three different bodies, so the benefits arm, the enforcement arm, and the border, the CBP, those were all encompassed within one agency, which used to be the INS, or Immigration Nationality Services.
very interesting. So is ICE like police? Is it like the equivalent to the police except for dealing with immigrants?
They are a federal, so they are a federal law enforcement agency. So yes, they are, they are part of the law enforcement infrastructure in the country. What is critical to know, though, however, and this is something that we'll kind of go into more deeply as we kind of go along in the discussion today, is that they are deputized, they are authorized only exclusively to enforce immigration laws. Okay, so found in the Immigration Nationality Act, and they are not authorized to enforce other, certainly not city or state, or other federal laws, right? So they are there exclusively. Unfortunately, however, what we see, and this is not unique to the current situation that we find ourselves today, but unfortunately, what we've seen repeatedly across time is our ICE agents kind of seeking to enforce laws well outside of the scope of their authority.
Okay. And I assume we'll get into some examples later. How can ICE agents be identified? Do they have a special uniform that they wear? What?
So sadly, I think we all know what the answer to that question is now. All of us have seen the terrifying images coming out of Boston, out of the arrest of the Turkish international student, who was a PhD student, if I remember correctly, who was essentially, and I'm going to repeat this word, and I'm going to say this often this evening, she was disappeared. And that's what we are seeing on our streets today is the disappearance of individuals from US streets. And that should be frightening. And so, I mean, to answer your question specifically, there is no way to identify them because as those officers who disappeared this young PhD student from Turkey, they were not they were not dressed in a particular way. There was no identifying markers on their insignia, on their uniforms, because they were not wearing uniform. They're essentially in civil dress. Um, and so it is impossible. It is oftentimes and most times impossible to tell whether or not a person is, an ICE officer or not. And in fact, what we've seen is ICE officers, in fact, covering their faces, which is horrifying. And so they're impossible to identify.
Yeah, and I think the covering their faces is a more recent phenomenon, yes?
I believe that's correct. I believe that's correct. But of course, what's interesting is to note is it's very purposeful. And so they kind of seek to hide their identities, not just their faces, not just who they are, what agency they represent, but they actually then use beyond how they dress, they use in terms of their wording when they present themselves. Oftentimes, you will hear them identifying as, we are the police, right? So we hear reports from clients, from communities, individuals not, being knocking on the door and saying, "This is police," and so they purposefully seeking to kind of obfuscate who they are.
So the next question is somewhat related to that, but a little bit more. What do ICE actions typically look like, or is that even an appropriate term, an ICE action?
So it is an absolutely appropriate term. Unfortunately, there is no typical action. And just in the short span of the last, I guess we're approaching 100 days, we've seen the different tactics and actions that ICE uses in detaining individuals. And so where are we seeing this? We're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing it in homes. We're seeing it at businesses. We're seeing it on cars, right? Car stops. And we're seeing it on streets, public streets. And who is being targeted? Again, we're seeing there's really very little limits to who is being targeted from individuals who are, so, recently we experienced the on the car wash in North Philadelphia, um, to targeting of individuals, that I mentioned, the tough students and other students, to the arrest and deportation of individuals who have specific protections issued by immigration judges that are being ignored. And so kind of what it actually looks like, there is no typical. There is, however, one kind of through line of all the arrests. And really, what we need to be focusing on is the collateral arrests. Because, and you're going to hear me use that term again repeatedly this evening, is the way that immigration ratchets up its numbers is through collateral arrests. And what we see these kind of throughout the different actions that I mentioned, right, in homes, in businesses, in car stops, and on the streets, is that ICE may or may not have one individual in mind, but when they're going in, they then take anybody who happens to have the bad luck of being in that location at that time. And so, the one through line of all the different types of actions are the collateral arrests that ICE is purposefully undergoing when doing these in going through these actions.
So, and I feel like those collateral arrests, correct me if I'm wrong, Philip, but I've heard a lot of people knocking on ICE agents knocking on doors asking for a particular person. And when the person who responds to the door says, oh, they don't live here or they don't live here anymore, then they start saying, well, let me talk to you. They arrest everybody in the house, even though that wasn't anybody related to the person that ICE said they were
That's
looking for, right?
That's exactly right, right? And we hear that same story playing out repeatedly across the board. So, for example, we'll see that in car stops as well, where the individual is inquired, the person that's being kind of sought or investigated is not just the person driving the car, but then whoever happens to be in the car at the same time. And so it's, again, same situation at the car wash that I mentioned earlier. It's kind of it's across the board, and that is not an exception. That's the rule. That is how they operate.
So to some extent you answered this, but I think it bears a little bit repeating and unpacking. Who is at risk of being arrested by ICE?
So unfortunately, so I'm going to answer this in two ways. As an agency, HIAS Pennsylvania has been working diligently over the last several months, kind of leading up to, following the elections, and certainly since inauguration, of doing Know Your Rights presentations across the region. And we, have been working in collaboration with other organizations around Philadelphia and around the state in doing these presentations. And kind of we are purposefully kind of walking kind of a tightrope between two important messages. The first message is it is critical that immigrant communities, as well as honestly, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but all of us, it's critical for all of us to understand what is happening, what the rights are that individuals in the United States, regardless of the immigration status, what rights we all have in order to be able to assert those rights and defend the Constitution. So these are critical. At the same time, we're also kind of underlining the fact that knowing our rights, knowing the powers that we individually have as individuals in this country, regardless of status, we as communities who are are supporting each other through this, that we have power in that, and not to instill fear and not to extend the fear beyond where it already is. And I believe all understand at this point where the fear level is. And so we're trying to walk that line. So that's all a preface to saying who's at risk. Unfortunately, as we're seeing, increasingly everybody. And again, I mentioned this before, from individuals who are undocumented, but as we're seeing exceedingly clear and purposefully, individuals with status. So again, students whose student visas have automatically been investigated and revoked at levels that we've never seen before, or I should say in modern history we haven't seen before, to individuals who have specific protections authorized and granted by an immigration judge. So again, the individual from El Salvador who had been granted withholding of removal specifically to El Salvador and was sent back, and to whom the administration subsequently said, oops, to individuals. So unfortunately, and what we've heard coming out of the administration is this interest in seeking to denaturalize folks. Now, I don't think it's worthwhile at this point to kind of conjecture as to what is he talking about in that regard and where's that going, because to a large degree, this is the attempt and focus on creating chaos, which is the point of all of this. But unfortunately, it's everybody, we've noticed that in phone calls to our agency that have exploded over the last 3-4 months of individuals who either are seeking services for us for the first time or whom we've represented in the past who are green card holders, who are naturalized U.S. citizens calling us in panic, asking, well, what is it for me? How does this impact me? And so, so I think, unfortunately, it's a large swath of individuals who are being impacted, and again, kind of regardless as to kind of immigration status or lack thereof, and regardless of countries of origin, and ethnic and racial and language backgrounds.
Thanks. And I just want to kind of add to that point, right? That we're also seeing people with legal status who either travel outside the country for vacation or to visit relatives, whatever reason that they're traveling outside the country, then they try to get back in and they can get detained, right? And so I mean, I know that we've seen an increase in callers um, who who have status, who wanted to go outside the country and now are concerned and are asking us, should they be traveling?
Yeah.
Um, and it's a hard question to answer. Um, I think also, the other thing I wanted to confirm with you, Philip, we've seen lots of statements coming from the White House about quotas, right? And so one of the problems is it's not like a quota of undocumented arrests, it's just a quota. So, so that's also what's putting everybody at risk. Um, and then I guess a final thing, you mentioned stripping naturalization, but there's also the administration has been quite busy since January 20th in stripping people of other statuses less strong than naturalization. But for example, the people that were here on parole, the people whose temporary protected status is going to expire. And I just want to confirm with you, my understanding is that during the campaign, we heard about the 11 to 13 million undocumented people. What the president has done in the last 100 days or so is create hundreds of thousands of more undocumented people, correct?
Exactly, which I think kind of highlights the inhumanity of our immigration laws as they've always existed, right? Um, you know, Congress and prior administrations would have been able to kind of correct the situation, right? I mean, and this is something, when I started practicing immigration law many years ago, we often would talk about this notion of a broken immigration system. And I long ago have stopped using that term because, in fact, the immigration system for decades has worked perfectly well for the purposes sought by those in power. I purposefully try to avoid using that term of a broken immigration system. And I think this is another perfect example of that, right? Is we will just kind of create these undocumented individuals and
And then
and so
claim that
be it.
they're all illegal.
And so be it. But I think the other part of it, not related to that to that kind of conclusion, is also the fact that it's clear that while he was really focusing on during his campaign, first one and this one, on quote unquote undocumented populations, the fact of the matter is he's attacking everybody. He's attacking everybody. And I mean, this is kind of beyond the scope of our discussion today, but I think it's well within the playbook of every piece of kind of actions that we find so abhorrent outside of the immigration realms as well, right? And again, something I'll come back to, but is it creating a system of fear to demand and to insist on silence from all of us, right? And so whether or not it's immigrants, whether or not documented or undocumented, to corporations, to universities, to funders, to law firms, and we can go on and on. And I think this is a playbook that has been clearly been written over the last 4 years.
Right. So how does ICE identify people to arrest? I mean, we've talked about that they're arresting kind of everyone. How do they make the decisions? How do they go about it?
Right. And that's, something when we do presentations to organizations that work and interact with immigrant communities is kind of our first kind of question, right? Is say, when you work with somebody, do you know what their status, immigration status is? And the answer to that is no, it's impossible. It's impossible. And so um, just as we can't know an immigration status of an individual, certainly ICE does not either, right? And that is why we are seeing constant and repeated and purposeful constitutional violations in the arrest and detention. Now, I do want to be clear. There are, the immigration system has ways in which to track, monitor, detect undocumented individuals and individuals who've gone through the immigration proceedings and what have you. And in terms of, so it's not as if that doesn't exist. It certainly does. But as I said before, the execution of those laws is lazy, and I would say purposefully lazy. And so it's not as if, and it's far from the fact that ICE is enforcing those laws against those individuals whom they've identified who've been processed. But again, right, going back to that notion of collateral arrests, and that is where the numbers are, and that's where they're really focusing in on. Or not focusing in on, but rather using this broad fishnet to kind of just gather up as many people as they can.
Okay. Can ICE agents enter people's homes to arrest them?
So this is a critical question and something that the administration has sought to basically another area where the administration has sought to basically eliminate constitutional rights. The Constitution and laws interpreting cases interpreting the Constitution have clearly articulated that the law on this is clear and that the Fourth Amendment right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures applies to all individuals in the United States, regardless of status, period. Now, of course, just as those rights to the Fourth Amendment rights are different, and the courts have interpreted, are different depending upon where those rights are asserted and where they come into question. Courts have regularly found that the area where the Fourth Amendment rights are most sacrosanct or most guarded are in the individual's home, right? The home is the sanctuary. And so the short answer to that is no. ICE cannot enter the home without either one of two things. One is either consent, and the second one is a valid judicial warrant. Unfortunately, they rarely, if ever, have a valid judicial warrant and will often use intimidation, threats, and lies to seek and gain access to the home. And then, unfortunately, that's where courts have interpreted that where the door is opened, that has essentially provided ICE the cover of a concession, of basically allowing that the enforcement agent to enter the home. And so that is why a focus of our trainings, and trainings happening by immigrant rights organizations across the country has really been to drive home this point. And I think we've heard reports from law enforcement from ICE who basically saying people asserting their rights makes our jobs harder. Yeah, it's too bad that we have the Constitution.
So annoying. I want to pick up on that point just specifically about the lies and judicial warrants. I've heard that ICE often uses a piece of paper and says, I have a warrant, I have a warrant. Can you talk more about that? I mean,
Sure.
mhm.
So in terms of to authorize law enforcement to either to search or arrest an individual without consent, the officer must have a valid judicial warrant issued by either a state or federal court judge. The warrants that ICE officers in general have in executing their searches, at least their initial search, right, not their collateral arrest, is a document issued by the Department of Homeland Security itself, which essentially has the word warrant, but it is not in effect a valid judicial warrant. And so in fact, it has very little, if any, kind of powers, and certainly not the power to enter a home, okay, or to search a premises without consent. And so that is the key difference between the two.
And I wonder, how difficult is it to get a judicial warrant? I mean, I know that ICE, clearly expresses concern and consternation about having to get those. Are they hard to get? Are they time consuming?
Well, I think the real question is does that matter? Right? Because would we say, well, why can't the police just come in and walk in through my front door right now? Do they really need a warrant? Right? Isn't that hard? Isn't that hard for them to get? Yeah, a lot of things in the world created by our founders in the Constitution and those amendments and that's been created. There was a reason for that. And certainly I would think that individuals on both the left and the right would say that those are important protections. And so this is no different, no different.
So, switching gears a little bit from the home, what should someone do if ICE comes to my workplace looking for someone with whom I work?
Right. So the workplace is, so we talked about kind of I lost the word there, but the sanctity of the home, right? And where courts have generally found that is where the Fourth Amendment protections are the highest. Okay. So once we leave the home and enter different areas, so be it in the car, or be it on the public streets, or be that in a business setting, those rights are different, and courts have interpreted that differently. So something we've been doing. There's been a lot of outreach that's happening in the business community, kind of educating employers who are frightened on many accounts. One is certainly for their employees, certainly for their clients who are attending their business, and also afraid of their bottom line, because as we've heard, and I know, Kathy, you've spoken about this, about businesses who've seen their business plummet, because people are not coming out. So it's different in terms of the kind of rights and responsibilities and what can happen there. What we've been kind of educating business owners at this point is that it's really important to identify areas within the business that are in fact private and not open to the public. So, let's take, for example, a restaurant. In a restaurant, obviously, the dining room area would be considered public. Anybody has access to that. So similarly, just as I entering a restaurant would have the right to access that restaurant, so would law enforcement, right? Police, ICE, what have you. However, I would not have the right to go into the kitchen of a restaurant. And so similarly, law enforcement would not. And so it's really critical that businesses kind of identify those areas that they can justifiably indicate as being private in order to kind of, assert and preemptively assert that right, which they have. In terms of kind of what should happen. So, should law enforcement enter, should ICE enter a workplace? And so, this is again kind of a clear example as to, why did ICE choose that car wash? I mean, because essentially that is the most public place possible that they could have accessed at that car wash, right? It was, if I understand correctly, it was basically right on the kind of right before the sidewalk. That area there certainly would be a public area. So, the things that what we say certainly is, one is not to run, regardless if you're in status, without status, what have you, is not to run, because that generates, could generate probable cause for law enforcement to kind of to search or arrest that individual. So it's not to run. Second one is essentially the importance of another constitutional right, which is the Fifth Amendment, right? In the Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. And so what we've been talking about and encouraging is individuals, regardless of their immigration status, and is to really assert that right. Because just as immigration does not know whether or not I'm a US citizen, permanent resident, or anything else, if I do not disclose that, and they don't have that information, and certainly don't have my name or what have you at the ready, that makes their jobs more difficult. And I think it's incumbent upon, again, all of us to make their jobs more difficult. And unless we're willing to live in a police state, right, in which show me your papers, in which law enforcement can regularly approach you and ask for your papers, which we know that they cannot do in the United States, then we should be kind of pushing back against that. So those are some things that we can do, regardless of our immigration status, kind of working with our colleagues at an employment site, at a work site.
Yeah, and so taking up on this point about what we can do, what, if anything, should people do if they see ICE agents approach someone in public?
So I think the example, again, going back to the Turkish student in Boston, so we are authorized, individuals in the United States are able to film, right? There is no law against filming. Now, you can't intervene, you can't kind of place yourself in between law enforcement, because that can be a violation of certain laws. However, there's no prohibition against videoing. And so one of the things that we're asking people to do, to think about, one is certainly videoing and taping and taking photographs of what's happening. But the other one is to really document as much as possible as to what's going on. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. So one is, obviously, we saw how much press and kind of how much shock there was as to what happened on the streets of Boston that day. So lifting that up and showing how that's happening kind of across the country is really important for advocacy purposes and for all of us to really understand what's at stake. But the other piece of that is the following: is immigration lawyers, in representing individuals who are in deportation proceedings or removal proceedings, have an opportunity where the facts are ripe, to argue essentially what are called motions to suppress, essentially to seek to throw out any evidence that the government is using in seeking to deport somebody, okay, because of violations of Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights or other regulations that govern ICE actions. Unfortunately, demonstrating the violation of a Fourth and Fifth Amendment right in and of itself is insufficient for immigration purposes. The Supreme Court has ruled on that. However, as I said, Fourth and Fifth Amendment rights do apply. But what an immigration lawyer would need to do to be successful in a suppression claim is to demonstrate that the violation was egregious or is widespread, so pattern in practice. And so that is where we as community members can really assist in documenting and demonstrating kind of the pervasiveness of these illegal actions, as well, and the egregiousness of these actions. And so, lawyers are thinking about it. Immigration law clinics are thinking about how do we ensure, and different organizations, ACLU, the Temple Scheller Institute, have done excellent reports kind of documenting these kind of egregious and extensive Fourth and Fifth Amendment violations.
And what can an individual do if they know they are at risk? I mean, I know that you and our other staff have given a lot of Know Your Rights trainings to communities. But, I think people on this call, first of all, as we've said, sadly, everyone is at risk. And second of all, you know, if you're on this call and you're not actually an immigrant, it is I would assume that you have immigrants in your life, loved ones, people who you care about. So what can people do if they know that they're at risk?
I think there's two things. One is that we've talked about is the notion that knowledge is power. And so, organizations across the city, across the state, across the country have developed amazing materials. We in HIAS Pennsylvania, in collaboration with Nationality Service Center, Catholic Social Services, uh, and Justice at Work and other organizations have developed excellent materials available on our website. So those are written materials in various languages. There's also videos that are available that have been produced similarly by various organizations, and Kathleen is posting that on the chat right now. Those videos Know Your Rights videos are available on our website. So there's great material. So knowledge is power. Getting this information out to all the impacted communities is one. And the other one is something that we've always said to clients and in presentations is it's always a good idea to kind of do an immigration checkup, right? I give the example of getting a health checkup from a physician recommended once a year. I think similarly, it's important for individuals, for immigrants, to get that immigration checkup. One is to kind of determine, is there any path? Is there any available path to regularize, stabilize one's immigration status? Okay, and sadly, the laws the way that they are, and again, not broken, but purposefully created, provide very limited avenues of relief for individuals. But one is there? And the second one is for that individual and that family to kind of get proper advisals in terms of understanding where they stand in terms of risk levels, right? So again, if we were to distinguish individuals who maybe have TPS or temporary protected status, or have an asylum application pending, or are green card holders, or are conditional permanent residents, or again, this panoply of immigration statuses, versus individuals who maybe have prior removal, deportation orders, okay? Individuals who may have prior contact with law enforcement, regardless as to the adjudication of the contact with law enforcement. All of those things kind of play a role in terms of evaluating and understanding where that individual sits vis-a-vis risks with immigration. And so I think getting that checkup is critical. And I think the third part of that, or the other part of that piece, is going to reputable immigration legal services. And that's kind of like our mantra that we say, every chance we get. Sadly, I've been doing this work for a long, long time now, and a week does not pass by when we do not receive a phone call through our intake line of an individual who says, I paid $500, I paid $1,000, I paid $10,000. Just before in November, former Senator Casey's office called our office to refer a case of an individual who paid $18,000 to a scheme, a notary scheme. And so this is kind of, and you can imagine that these schemes, both by unlicensed individuals, right? So non-lawyers, as well as lawyers who are kind of there and see a good opportunity to make money, is rampant, and particularly nowadays when there's fear, right? Fear generates easy money. And so what we can all do is really make sure that we're guiding individuals to legal representation and counsel, to reputable immigration attorneys. Now, sadly, um,
It's not
agencies,
enough.
unfortunately, agencies such as ours, and I think we'll be talking about this a little bit later, are under attack. And so just at the same time as the threats are increasing, the access to services is being attacked. And so,
Yeah. And I want to just take a brief detour. A perfect example of the government's really thorough attacks in terms of attacking both immigrants and those that are here to serve them. And we'll talk about this more at our next program. But there had been a contract paid for by the federal government to represent immigrant children, and the contract was terminated by the government in the same moment that the government started something called rocket dockets, where children were kind of passed through really, really, really quickly. So in one swoop, they lost their lawyers and they suddenly had to go to court like much more quickly than they had to. And that's just one example, and we're going to talk about that more in the next program. But I think there's nothing starker than that example um, of attacking from both sides. Um, okay, so you touched upon this a little bit, but I think it's helpful to kind of list out in bullet points what are people's rights if they are arrested by ICE.
so the first, the most important one is the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. And kind of the second piece of that one is the right not to sign anything without having an opportunity to speak with a lawyer first. And ICE will regularly use scare tactics and lies to coerce individuals to sign documents that they have no clue as to what's in it. Um, and so those are bless you.
Okay.
Those are the most important, um, rights to understand. Now, I think to make sure that we get to this point, and for those of you who don't know, unfortunately, one of the rights that you do not have is to have an attorney appointed to you if you can't afford one. And I was just speaking with a colleague recently, who's not an immigration attorney, who did not realize that people are being arrested, people are being detained, people are being jailed, people are sitting in jail for months, if not longer. People are being separated from their families. People are being deprived of access to anything that we would qualify as kind of adequate medical care, um, for somebody in jail, all while going without a lawyer unless they are lucky enough to either A, be able to afford one, or B, able to find free legal representation, which is so very, so scarce in the country. And so it kind of boggles the mind, because essentially what we're saying is someone can sit in jail, someone can be deported, someone's life can be threatened, right? Whether or not that's somebody being sent to a country where they fear persecution, or simply tearing apart families, tearing apart mothers and fathers from their children, all without access to a lawyer. And that is because immigration enforcement is civil in nature and is not criminal enforcement.
Um, so how are people with legal status being detained?
Good question.
Right. I mean, we saw the Turkish student, back to her again, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, in those instances, uh, the Secretary of State apparently is sitting there and reviewing social media and determining, who needs to be silenced and who needs to be, so in that situation, I think they all turn around and say, oh, no, she was not in legal status. We actually terminated her visa. Of course, oftentimes the school is not informed, and certainly the individual in question is not informed of that. But we do have situations of the lawful permanent resident, the Columbia student, who was arrested in front of his pregnant wife. And so this is how, and now they're using the Alien Enemies Act, right? And I believe that's what they're using against this Mr. Khalil. But this is kind of a tactic that is not unique to this administration. This is just a dramatic expansion of that kind of initial foray that he had during the first administration.
Where are people being held when they're detained by ICE in Pennsylvania?
So, this is not a new secret, but it's the dirty little secret of what we call the immigrant prison industrial complex. And that's what it is. Take a look at your stocks, take a look at where you have your money invested. But Geo Group, and I'm sorry, the second big company that operates these businesses, it's slipping my mind, but there are two large private businesses, have been in operation for decades. And who noticed, wow, we can get lots of money for detaining individuals, and we are subject to a lot less scrutiny in terms of how we house and provide kind of even the most basic levels of care for individuals, as opposed to kind of state and federal prisons. And so in Pennsylvania, sadly, we have a private facility in Moshannon Valley, which is the largest in the Northeast, housing approximately, and don't quote me, but over 1,800 individuals. So 1,800 beds in Moshannon Valley. So an individual who's detained in Philadelphia will generally always go to the ICE Enforcement and Removal Office on 8th Street, where they'll be processed for a certain period of time, and then they'll be shipped out. Now, they may be shipped out to Moshannon, which is the closest facility, but what we see, of course, is immigration is very quick to move individuals to either further and more remote places. So one of their favorite places to send individuals to is a detention site in Mississippi, far, far from any state, any city with any sizable immigrant lawyer population or advocates. That is, of course, purposeful. And so they are essentially shipping individuals kind of across the country to detain individuals. Although, of course, what we're seeing now, which is kind of the newest iteration of this, is basically offshoring immigration detention, right? So the recent removal of individuals not from El Salvador to the El Salvadoran prisons.
Right. And I think one more point of clarification for the non-lawyers in the room on Zoom with us, you might have seen a lot of headlines, particularly with Mahmoud Khalil, but also with several others being moved to Louisiana. So what's that about? Lawyers, it's about the judges, right? So if you're moved to Louisiana and then you argue that the person's in Louisiana, so the hearing should be in Louisiana, then you get a Louisiana judge. And shock of shocks, Louisiana doesn't have a really high track record of granting asylum or or other kinds of relief for immigrants, right?
Right.
So you started to talk about this, but I guess I'm curious to know more. So what happens after someone is detained by ICE? You talked about 8th Street. What's at 8th Street? What happens there?
So 8th Street is the office for what's called ICE ERO, or Enforcement and Removal Office. And so that is where kind of initial processing happens. And an individual may be detained there for hours or overnight or what have you before being moved to one of the facilities.
And so I assume there's fingerprints, photographs that are taken?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's between 8th and corner of 8th and Cherry, if I'm not mistaken.
Um, so what can any of us do if we know someone is detained by ICE? Like, so we sort of have discovered that they're detained by ICE, but now what?
Right. So, I mean, what we hope and what we're doing in these Know Your Rights trainings is preparing individuals should the worst happen. And so, one thing is for individuals to collect all of the critical and important documents related to themselves, everything from biographic documents to medical documents documenting, any ailments or issues that they or their loved ones may have, as well as documentation evidencing kind of how they are part of the community, whether or not that's documentation regarding their children and their well-being, or illnesses, or their school accolades or what have you, right? Because all of that information is going to be kind of the first ask of any immigration lawyer to basically get a picture of who this is that they're working with, and then what are the possible avenues. And so essentially it's a detective job for an immigration lawyer to first piece all of those parts together. So I mean, so the first thing an individual should really be doing is making sure that they've collected that information. The second piece is, if they don't already have an immigration attorney, but hopefully having phone number for an immigration attorney, a reputable immigration attorney. And so, one of the roles that we do here at HIAS Pennsylvania, as well as other organizations, is if we are unable to represent individuals, we will refer individuals to the list of immigration attorneys that we've worked with, and that we know who do reputable work in the region.
Um, and what about children? Can they be detained by ICE?
Sadly, yes. There are rules currently still in place that limit the amount of time that ICE can detain children before moving them to a different facility operated by a different entity, federal entity. But yes, the fact of the matter is that children can be detained. Fact of the matter is that parents who may be the sole caregivers of children can be and are detained.
So we're going to break for questions in just a minute, but it's a good segue to let you know on May 6th at 7 o'clock p.m. Our youth program manager, Stephanie Lubert, is going to be doing a program with me to talk about how immigrant children are faring under this administration. And spoiler alert, they're faring really poorly. So anyway, I guess I want to end with one final question that's a little bit off track, but I think really, really critical given this is about ICE and detention and how we got here. You mentioned talking about that our immigration system is not broken, it's functioning exactly the way it's supposed to. And I think that that is a really critical point to make. And so, can you talk just very briefly before we go to the questions about undocumented? I mean, who are the undocumented and why are there so many? Um,
Yeah, I guess, do we have a couple more hours? Um, so I'll answer this a couple of ways. Who's undocumented? We all are. Under the way that this administration is operating, we all are. And whether or not that's in an immigration enforcement sphere, whether or not that is in other actions against marginalized communities, we all are, right? And we all know kind of the famous quote, right? First they came for, quote. I don't think I need to go through that. And so that's my first response, is I think we all are. In terms of the short answer of a long question, I guess, is one critical thing to understand is that that immigration status is not static. And so it is very easy for an individual, okay, or not surprising, I should say, for an individual to go from in status, let's say an individual who entered on a student visa and an F1, or maybe a tourist visa, a B1 or a B2, to fall out of status, become undocumented, okay, to then to obtain, let's say, some temporary non-immigrant status, let's say temporary protected status, to then potentially changing status to another non-immigrant status, let's say a U visa available for, right, to then becoming a permanent resident. Okay, so again, we see that trajectory is not linear, but nor static, and really can shift. And those dynamics are also at play within families. And so that's what we see when we use the term mixed status families. You'll hear that a lot, where there are individuals and family units comprised of U.S. citizens, permanent residents, temporary statuses such as DACA, deferred action, and undocumented, all kind of in the same household. And so that's why, again, it's critical. And I think this administration has blown past this notion of seeking out undocumented. It's clear that everyone's on the table. But even if even if we were to give lie to what they were purportedly saying, all of these communities are impacted, right? Because all of these individuals are being targeted.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Philip. I want to turn to the questions. I'll start in the chat.